Russia will hold presidential elections in March. Vladimir Putin has announced he's running for a fourth term in office, but will he face any viable opposition? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. He's been in power for nearly 20 years, a dominant figure in Russia's post-Soviet political scene. Vladimir Putin now says he's running for a fourth term in office as an independent candidate, backed by the ruling United Russia Party. And his power and influence appear to only get stronger, making it difficult for any opposition candidate to make progress. Putin has served as either prime minister or president since 1999, and if he wins the election in March, it would mean he would have spent 24 years as leader by the end of his term. The former KGB agent is the longest-serving leader since Joseph Stalin. He's had to deal with 4 US presidents, 4 British prime ministers, and 2 German chancellors. And while opinion polls are up for debate, they suggest Putin remains a popular figure. His approval rating hasn't dropped below 80% since 2014. With Vladimir Putin's reign likely to continue, is there really any opposition in Russia? And why has it been so ineffective in challenging him? Let's take a look at some of the opposition leaders. Perhaps the most well-known is Alexei Navalny. He's been campaigning against Putin all year, but he's now been barred from the race over a suspended prison sentence he says was fabricated. Navalny is calling for a nationwide boycott of next year's vote. Former TV personality Ksenia Sobchak has been clear to run. She's been critical of Kremlin policies in the past, but has steered clear of attacking the president. But some have questioned her appearance in the campaign. Her father was a former mentor of Vladimir Putin. And Pavel Grudinin has been nominated as the candidate for the Communist Party. He is largely unknown on the political scene, having run farms on the outskirts of Moscow. His nomination is seen as the party trying to widen its appeal to everyday voters. Let's bring in our guests. In Moscow, Sergey Strokan, a columnist for the politics and business newspaper Kommersant. In London, Andrew Wood, Britain's former ambassador to Russia. And joining us on Skype from outside Moscow, Alexander Soloviev, chairman of Open Russia, a movement that is dedicated to democracy and human rights. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me start by asking you this question, Mr. Strokan. Alexei Navalny has been prosecuted by the government in 2013, retried this year, barred from running for the elections. Is the establishment in Russia afraid of Navalny?
Obviously, the issue of Alexei Navalny and his non-participation in the election is one of the hot-button issues of the current presidential race, which is in full swing. Let me start by saying that President Putin himself deliberately avoids any mentioning of the name of Alexei Navalny. And probably this is a hint that Moscow is trying somehow to scale down the problem of ardent critic of Kremlin, who is showing that he has guts to crush the Kremlin wall, how he puts it. So it seems that while Navalny's non-participation is obvious fact, still it is not clear to what extent it will bring this election, since Navalny has already called for his ardent supporters to exercise a sort of a public disobedience, voter strike. And I think that to some extent probably he would succeed, in the sense that we will see some outbursts of discontent. However, let us not exaggerate the issue, since he is not yet that popular leader who is able to do something similar what was done by Boris Yeltsin when he was climbed in the tank and became and skyrocketed from former Soviet apparatchik to the head of the Russian state.
Mr. Wood,
so with Navalny, this is not yet the case.
Mr. Wood, you served as an ambassador to Russia. You know the general perception in the international community about elections, free speech, and smooth transition to democracy in Russia. Do you think that barring someone like Alexei Navalny in this election is definitely going to undermine the chances of having free, fair elections in Russia?
I think certainly, yes, though I agree with much of what the previous speaker just said. I don't doubt that Navalny would have got in some pretty sharp hits on the level of corruption. And it's also true that he has quite a wide following throughout the country. On the other hand, there's a widespread apathy about this election. And I think Putin's problem is presenting himself as a reinvigorated figure, as a person with a new program. And I think he's going to find that very, very difficult indeed. Without that, it's also important to remember that this is, at least according to the Constitution, Putin's last possible term. By the time he reaches the end of in 2024, he'll be, I think it's 72. He would have to wait for another 6 years for another president to occupy the seat before he could have another go, and I think it's just not practical.
Mr. Soloviev, your movement, Open Russia, has expressed initially backing for Navalny. Now that he's been banned, what are the options for you and for the Russian opposition in general?
Well, according to the official position of the movement, actually, we say that if you have another alternative candidate, democratic candidate, you may support him. But actually, these elections are not elections because these are not, elections in the whole meaning of this word. I mean, this has been invented. The whole spectacular has been invented just to not even to re-elect Putin president, but to say that he's again president, and he decided that, you know. So we do not think that these elections are going to be legitimate or something, but still we say that it's a good platform in order to say, which we have to use this platform to spread the information about the disastrous situation in Russian elections. And if it's needed to, if you need to spread this information, you may use some different candidates in order to help them and to spread this information.
Let's see who's who in this election, particularly the opposition. Mr. Strokan, now, the communists now are opting for Pavel Grudinin instead of Gennady Zyuganov, who has been a fixture in past elections. Do you think that the communists are now trying to reinvent themselves and reach out to a bigger base?
Actually, that's $1 million question, and Pavel Grudinin is one of the enigmas of this election. We got used to the fact that normally when we have to go for elections, the Communist Party is represented by political heavyweight, its leader and veteran of Russian politics, Gennady Zyuganov. Let me just remind our audience that in 1996 he narrowly missed the election to Boris Yeltsin, and some are saying that actually it was Gennady Zyuganov who was elected, not Boris Yeltsin, but the election was rigged. But after this one campaign after another, probably communists got to understanding that there's no way for Gennady Zyuganov to win. So they're trying to reinvent themselves, and Pavel Grudinin, as a self-made, not politician, but he is the head of the collective farm, which is quite successful, and he's running as independent. So independent and Communist Party agreed to support him. So probably this is an attempt to reinvent the communist idea. But let me add to that this is not only a phenomenon of Pavel Grudinin. President Putin, for the first time, is also going for this election not as representative of United Russia pro-Putin party, but as a self-appointed candidate. So that's a tendency when leading candidates are trying to stay away from leading parties.
Mr. Wood, along with the communist, there is Ksenia Sobchak, a socialite, media star. There's also the ultra-nationalist Vladimir Zhirinovsky. Are these people likely to make about a change, or are they just more of window dressings in a political landscape where ultimately the result is known? It's definitely going to be Vladimir Putin.
I don't doubt it's going to be Vladimir Putin. And in fact, this is not, I don't think he's ever run under a party label, but plainly United Russia is the party which specifically supports him. The others are essentially straw candidates. Ksenia Sobchak might say some interesting things, but I think in practice the only people who might have said interesting things are Navalny and possibly Yavlinsky, who always speaks interestingly, but nobody listens. So no, it's not a true election. It's not contested.
These elections are a good platform for the opposition and for their candidates to say things, to rally out support. But then there's this argument which says that the presence of any candidate in such contested elections just gives more legitimacy to Vladimir Putin, and that people should have abstained, should have said, no, we should boycott the elections.
Well, you know, the problem is that when you call people to boycott elections, most of the people usually assess that as a passive boycott, and you cannot detect them. I mean, they just stay home and don't go to vote and keep sitting on their sofas. That's why if you do call people for boycotting these elections, you should call them to do something, you know, kind of an active boycott. So it is a question to discuss which ways we can use for this active boycott. But actually, helping differing candidates does not necessarily mean that you help Putin to legitimize these elections. Actually, when you have access to the audience, you may specifically underline that this is not legitimate elections, and we take part in it just to make it possible to say these words, because otherwise we don't have this opportunity, because we don't have any access to the mass media when there's no elections. So we just use these elections as a source, as a tool. And by the way, some of the candidates also say that. For instance, Yavlinsky and Sobchak and Navalny as well says that these elections are actually been not fair from the very beginning. These are not elections, to be precise.
Mr. Strokan, what is the opposition's biggest problem in Russia? Is it is not able to bring about a very strong candidate, or its agenda is a little bit disconnected from the real concerns of the Russian people?
Well, let us be frank. Russia's opposition is in a bad shape. Of course, we can argue what is the reason for that, but at the moment we don't have a candidate who can actually challenge President Putin. Even Alexei Navalny, with all his guts, as I said, he can rely on an obscure group of his ardent supporters, and he can hardly enjoy vast popular support. As far as Ksenia Sobchak is concerned, I personally don't consider her candidate at all. I think she's an imitation of opposition candidate, and for me, probably the moment of truth is a moment when she acknowledges that she is not running to win the election, but she says that her mission is just to send a signal to people, which will come as a wake-up call for the audience. So I'm asking myself, if the person is participating in election, if it is contesting not to win the election, can I call the person a candidate? So I would never vote for such a candidate who is running for some other, and some are even saying that she is Kremlin project to distract the voters from Alexei Navalny. So all in all, it seems that Russian opposition, when it comes to the 2018, was not able to come up with a strong leader and a coherent program of democratic reforms. We don't see this at all.
Okay,
Let's be frank.
Mr. Wood, is the problem, talking about the opposition, is it this inefficiency, is it just something which is intrinsic to the opposition generally in Russia, or is it because the establishment does not allow for vocal critics of the system to stay there? We've seen Khodorkovsky forced into exile, Nemtsov assassinated, and people silenced by the establishment.
That is true. It is the second, because there is no means for them to participate or form public opinion, let alone public followings. But I would add that, in fact, also you could describe President Putin, as he now is, as not a candidate either. He has nothing else new to say. He's very unlikely to have any disturbing new policies or interesting new policies to promote. And I think voter apathy is going to be a very marked feature of this occasion. One has to say election because that's what it is officially, but actually it is not a contested ballot, it is not a contested argument, and I think it's extremely unlikely that President Putin, any more than the others, will indulge in public argument. He would just say, I'm here, vote for me.
Mr. Soloviev, you are...
coronation, really.
So Soloviev, you are united against Putin, but you don't seem to be really united in the spirit to have a common agenda. Just give you one idea, for example. You are not united about who should lead the opposition, and your movement, which is Open Russia, is seen with loads of skepticism by different parties because of the background of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Many see him as an oligarch, not as a reformer.
Well, actually, Mikhail Khodorkovsky says that in an open way that he's not gonna run for presidency. It's not interesting for him, and he says that no matter how hard it is, but still the time of such a people like me, is talking about himself, has passed. And he says, like me and like Putin, a time of such people has already passed. And that's the problem of Russia, that some of the people, for instance, like Putin, does not understand that his time has passed. And that's why the problems, keep collecting in our country. So our movement has no, I cannot agree with the fact that our movement has no idea whom to be the leader of the opposition. We just think that we must have a lot of really bright leaders within the opposition who's not going to be divided, but they're going to be in one team. Of course, they will have their problems within, but still we're trying to say that this is very important to keep contacting each other, although this is sometimes even impossible. And yes, we do have this awful problem within Russian opposition. We cannot get along sometimes with each other, but still, the experience shows that if we just keep our ambitions within us, everything is possible. And let's try to make it possible for the different leaders to rise.
At the center of the debate is the president, Vladimir Putin, who's run the country, the longest-serving president since Joseph Stalin. Mr. Strokan, how do you explain, how is Russia trying to explain the fact that this man enjoys an unprecedented approval rating of about 80%?
I think that I have to recall a popular joke. You see, we Russians, we are cynical people sometimes when it comes to politics, so we are trading jokes. So according to one of the jokes that the second article of the Russian Constitution says that the president of the Russian Federation is elected by the outgoing president of the Russian Federation. So probably this is the case with President Putin. But this particular term would be different from the previous terms in a sense that this would be a transition period, since everybody understands that this would be a final term of President Putin. So the major question for all of us here, and not only for political and business elite, is there life after Putin? Specifically, what sort of Russia we would inherit after his another term expires, and whether the stability, which is considered to be the major legacy of President Putin, would also be cherished and preserved in post-Putin era. Who would be his successor, and to what extent he would be able to follow Putin's policy, whether he would not challenge and risk him the way how the new Russian leaders were denouncing the legacy of their predecessors. Just look at Russia's history and see that normally this is the case, starting from Lenin till Boris Yeltsin and Putin.
Mr. Wood, I mean, the growing role that Putin has been playing in Russia has been puzzling for international diplomats operating in Moscow. Do you think, is it because the man has been leading the country into unprecedented economic growth? He's been seen as restoring the national pride, which many believe was bruised during the times of Boris Yeltsin, or are there any other factors?
Well, there are other factors, but first of all, on the question of economic growth, that is now a prospect of the past, at any rate on anything other than a modest scale. Secondly, the so-called victories are essentially illusory. I don't see that they're to the good of the Russian people. But thirdly, I think it's important to realize that what he has done is to destroy all other institutions. The parliament doesn't really matter. There is no judicial system which will produce reliable justice in Russia. There is no reason for business people to invest heavily in where there's any risk at all of running foul of the administration. So it isn't that it's just Putin. It is that there is nothing but the president of the day and the FSB. And that is not a secure foundation on which to build a reliable and good partner for the rest of the world, or for that matter, for Russia to prosper.
Mr.
So the importance of this election is not so much whether Putin will win, but whether there is any chance of some more coherent system emerging after him. He won't leave a successor who will do that. It's too threatening to him.
Mr. Soloviev, I mean, we know the outcome of the election. Putin is set to become president for a fourth term, but don't you think that the next 6 years will be extremely crucial for you in the opposition to be able to sit together, get your act together and move forward with one platform, one agenda and a very strong candidate to run for the 2024 elections?
To say the truth, it is already extremely difficult because, as you may know, our movement, Russian officials are trying to say that our movement is a foreign movement, although we are a Russian movement. And they're trying to say that we are an undesirable organization in Russia, although it breaks even their own law, which they invented to make it easier to ban different organizations. All the independent resources, all the independent mass media is being blocked. A lot of opposition leaders are being arrested. So they have this new tactic. They don't put people to prison for a lot of years. They just put them constantly for 30 days, according to administrative arrest, and then people go out the jail, spend a few days in freedom, and then they again put them according to the administrative arrest. So this is quite difficult to fight for your rights in this situation. But still, it doesn't mean that we should give up. Of course, we will continue doing that. Of course, we will invent new methods. We will invent new ideas because, otherwise it's all futile. Otherwise, we shouldn't give up.
Okay, I have one last question for Mr. Strokan. I mean, we've been talking about who is going to succeed Vladimir Putin, and many believe that the best bet or the safest bet for him would be to have some of the acolytes that he has been grooming for quite some time. Do you think that Nikolai Patrushev, Sergey Shoigu or Anton Alekhanov, one of them is likely to become the successor of Putin?
I personally think that this is a futile exercise at the moment to point a finger at Mr. Patrushev or to Mr. Shoigu or to someone else. I personally believe that this will be a name which would come as a major surprise to all of us, the way it worked with Boris Yeltsin. Probably just let me recall the famous question of American journalists who asked who is Mr. Putin, you remember. And when outgoing President Yeltsin, with his poor health, appeared on TV, swallowing words and pronounced the name Vladimir Putin, all journalists rushed to the archives and to the web to see who is really Vladimir Putin. Despite we had a full plate of well-known politicians like Gennady Zyuganov. So I think that in 6 years something similar will happen. While everybody would talk about the people who are more or less known, we will all of a sudden wake up to new reality. We will have here a new name, and then we will ask who is Mr. Such and Such.
Okay.
This is the nature of Russian politics.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there as the show comes to an end. Gentlemen, Sergey Strokan, Andrew Wood, and Alexander Soloviev, thank you very much indeed for your contribution. And thank you too for watching You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here, bye for now.